And now we're going to continue with the subject, the theme of space. And we're going to look at a King's Indian game that Matt played. And here we go. So, H3, and I believe one of the things I wanted to put these games together is I believe Vishnu also likes to play with this H3 thing. And we talked about it before, and there's some similarities into the problems that Matt has in this game that Vishnu has. And one thing we're going to see with Matt's notes is he's reliant a lot on what the computer's going to say. And the computer, of course, can oftentimes tell you great moves, but especially if you're playing a position like this, you're going to want to have a sense of just what to do, right? Because it's going to become really hairy, and you just want to have a sense of like, okay, this is where I want to put my pieces. This is how, I want to have my setup. Okay, so knight d7, a little weird, but fine. And that's the idea. Here we go. So white is playing for space, and black plays a5, which we can debate, but let's start talking about the game from this position. Black, of course, could have done other things. Personally, I like the move. I'll just give a shout out here for knight h5. I think that move's interesting for black. In any case, the thing that white should understand, and this is actually very complicated, is that in general, he is playing on the queen side because his pawns are pointing that way. However, with h3, you have embarked on something totally different, which is to at some point play g4 and either slow down the black play on the king side. This is his side of the board. Either slow it down or make it just simply not feasible because of the opening up to his king. So for that reason, this move, bishop e2, is not great. And let's read what he says. He says, actually, Stockfish likes bishop e2 better than g4. But think about it from a human point of view. What are you doing with the bishop on e2? Do you want to castle? The computer might want to castle, but I don't think you do, right? You want to play g4 and put a clamp onto the king side, right? So in a way, the computer's confusing you a little bit, I think, here in this position, right? Whereas I'm going to guess, I didn't actually do this, maybe I should have, is if you look this up in the database, you're going to find most of the strong players played g4, because that's the dream of this h3 move. Let me give a quick shout out to a totally different position with this g4, because we're going to see a little bit here. It has a corresponding cousin in the French advance, where you get this kind of thing. Queen b6, a3, and c4. Well, let me take that back to c4. Black can play c4, but the idea of a3 is very similar to the King's Indian h3, where we want to gain space with b4, but it's not necessarily that we're playing on the queen side. This is the hard part to understand. It's that by playing b4, you're going to make it hard for black to do his business on the queen side, right? And then you're going to crush him on the king side. Or, as in our case over here, we want to shut him down on the king side and then crush him on the queen side. Okay, speech over, I promise. Bishop e2, v6. Now, in general, a mistake, because we like to say that that you don't want to make pawn moves on the weak side of the board because you're going to create weak squares. And the reason weak squares on your weak side of the board, black's queen side for him, is going to be hard to deal with is it's just harder for you to bring power to bear on that side of the board, whereas it's going to be easier on the king side. This is also an instructive mistake because in general, well, let me put it this way. What it feels like is it feels like black is saying, oh, I need to guard my knight before I play knight c5. But what he should understand is first of all, even if white could just win a pawn here, which I don't think he can, but let's just say he could, I'm not sure it's totally a great thing, because you got rid of your beautiful bishop and you unleashed the Kraken over here with knight e5. And of course, I think you just take that thing as well. Habs asks, so if g4 instead of bishop e2, do you have an idea yet where you want that light square bishop? Good question. Let's put it over here. So g4. The answer is not entirely. I think what I'm going to do is, depending on what black does, I'm really going to look to see what black does. But in general, the setup is going to be something like knight d2, queen c2, castles. And then I'm going to think about, on every move, I'm going to think about moves like h4, h5. And I might think about rook g1. I'm just trying to make f5 as unpleasant for black as possible. And if I can't stop it, I want to blunt it. So for example, with that a3, b4 in the French, the other move or idea that can happen here is something like this. Knight e8, knight d2. Now, of course, you can take it, okay? But I just want to show an idea here, and that's you can play f3. Just to blunt, just to say, black, you're not actually going to crack me or do anything fancy. Now, this is a little bit rich because of bishop f6, bishop h4, but I just wanted to show it as an idea. And no, the terrible light square bishop does not know where to go yet. Okay. When you are playing, let me put it this way. When you are playing for space, oftentimes it's no longer about your development anymore. And I know that because I'm a tempo fiend, and I have advocated for playing for tempi and development so often on this show, that it's a hard thing for me to both advocate, and I know it's a hard skill to master. It's one of the reasons I think I don't personally like playing with space that much. And you can watch a video I did about Bobby Fischer not liking to play with space as well. And I think it's this part of the thing is slowing down your development is a very hard thing, even psychologically, to do. Okay, so b6, terrible move. He gives you the time. And right, I totally agree with you. You should play g4 before anything else. Now we're going to get an interesting position. And for all the King's Indian players out there, it can seem scary when black, for us, and let me put it this way, I've had students who are like, I can't play f5 and open my king up that much. And the thing you have to realize is that's your side of the board. It's very difficult for white to bring power to bear on that side of the board. That's why your king is ultimately not the problem. If I was worried for you, it's more these squares. Not the a5 one, but the light squares over here, and later the domination of your pieces. That one, and that one in particular. Okay, so let's look. Snip, I think f3 was an option, but honestly I think black is okay here. f3, f4, good move, bishop f2, and I think bishop f6 was plausible here for black, but he goes ahead and plays knight f6. Queen c2, knight h5, and here I think a very instructive mistake. Right, I thought this one was a real interesting one. So when we think about, let's just stop for a second and talk about the position. This bishop is so valuable. In general, in the King's Indian, it's going to be incredibly valuable, but it really is a monster here because all of our pawns are on light squares, and correspondingly, this guy is absolutely terrible. And for black, it's the opposite. This is his terrible thing, and that's his beautiful bishop. So stare at this move for a second, rook g1, and think about why it's so terrible. It's so natural. Right? It's hard to imagine it's so terrible. I think it's a very instructive mistake because it's a little bit subtle. At first it feels like, how could rook g1 be wrong? And the answer is, well, let me say this. Why does rook g1 feel natural? Because it feels like, oh, we're attacking the king. But part of the problem there is, no, you're not attacking the king. That's his side of the board. Just look at your pieces. How are they ever going to get over there? And it shows how difficult this position is to understand, because really white's aim, if anything, is going to be to castle and play king b2 and then a3, b4. And just as black is not afraid of playing f5, f4, white isn't afraid of weakening his structure on the queen side as that much either. It's about space. And yeah, pushing this knight back into oblivion over here. Okay, so why is rook g1 a problem? Because after rook g1, you will not be able to play h4 when black plays bishop f6. And the problem is if that bishop comes to h4, if he gets that trade, then we are in a dark, dark place. We are in a dark, dark place. That's the reason. Rook g1, king h8, castles, bishop f6, and now we can't play h4. If I could magically put my rook back on h1 and play h4, well, then I would have at least prevented black's key idea, right? So, h4, you gave this a question mark, but honestly, like, the position is now, it's so hard to find a plan. And one funny thing is if you were going to do something, I would suggest something like king b2 and this kind of business. But because you can't do anything on the king side. So with h4, you're at least saying to yourself, well, you know what? If he takes it, at least maybe I'll get some h-file stuff. And that's at least an idea, right? I didn't like that. I think the guy should have just taken the pawn on h4. And again, it's not to steal a pawn. That's not the point of taking the pawn. It's to trade those dark square bishops, right? It's not like this guy's going to come and win the endgame immediately. But if I can get rid of that thing, oh man, that'll be a good thing. All right. So the problem, though, for white is he didn't defend it. And here we needed to play rook h1. And I'm assuming here now that white is lost. h5, very strong move from your opponent. And queen h2. And this shows really clearly, actually, the dangers of when you're playing against the king's Indian, that even when your king goes to the queen side, he still wants to murder you on his side of the board, right? Okay, 6-point bishops. That's right, patient chess. So actually, it's really nice that this bishop was developed and sat on his home square. Just to explain the reference, my friend Dave Vigorito wrote a book on the King's Indian, and in particular with the Mar del Plata variation, which is a similar structure to this, where the pawn gets to f4. He said that the bishop on c8 was worth 6 points, and the main pedagogical value of that is just to say, look, the rook isn't as important because the bishop on c8 will always be necessary to crack the white defenses, usually the king being over here on the king side. Okay, I thought so too, Habs. A very instructive game. Maybe I'll just play it a couple moves out. Black played really well, and he's just murdering him on the dark squares here. Okay, next game. This is Gina. I'm going to flip the board here for us. And by the way, this game, I started going over it without realizing that it was in fact a like a blitz game, like a 10-minute game. And so, in general, I don't want to cover this kind of game, but I did start it. All right, here we go. So, b6, e3, bishop b7, bishop e2, castles. And this game, by the way, is still part of what I'm calling this section on space. Everything we're doing so far has to do with space. And in this game, black is going to have theoretically a little bit less space, but is going to be doing fine. I've played this position a number of times from black, and white now plays a3. And as any Nimzo Indian player will tell you, it's always an interesting dynamic when a3 is played. Right now, a3 looks poor because the bishop on c1 is going to have trouble getting out But the long-term intention for white should be to play e4 and have a life with that bishop on c1. And I don't think he understood that when he played a3. So d6, knight e4, okay. Bishop b2, and I think bishop b2 is the beginning of a poor plan from white. Now, listen, this is a blitz game, and it's about to get crazy, but I think the first several moves were very well played by black, and there's a couple instructive moments. So, let's talk about space in this position. Black, is going to be playing, it's actually going to get violent very soon with f5, and then the knight will come here, and then black will have a choice of violent moves with either getting the queen out if the knight moves, or if not, to swing the rook, or just to bring the knight into f6. There's been a variety of games that can happen, or let's say there are a variety of ways that this setup can happen from different openings. And what white should understand is that the square e4 needs to be controlled, and that the bishop on c1 needs to be in contact with this diagonal. Because, well, this diagonal isn't going anywhere. So terrible move, bishop b2. Where it would get interesting is if white played queen c2, knight d7, and here I think is an instructive move, something like knight e1. And the point is simply that I'm going to play f3 no matter what, and then black will have questions about where do the knights go. Let's just say, for example, like this. Where do the knights go? They're kind of knocking against each other, and the bishop is wondering exactly what it's doing too. I think it's fundamentally equal here, but this is the way white should play. And so white has space, and he's playing against the bad pieces, and black, of course, can claim that the knight on e1 is funny. Very interesting strategical struggle here. So bishop b2, knight d2. Like I said, I'm not sure you want to trade stuff, and I really like what black does. f5, exclam. So now we've got, there's a bird. This is like a bird's opening where you get that powerful bishop on b7. And d5. Here, I really like what Gina wrote in the notes, because black played a very nice, simple move here with e5. But let's stress that that's not really what we want, because the bishop wants freedom on this diagonal. This move was a colossal mistake. And in terms of, I don't believe that pawns are people, but there's a good rule of thumb about when you've got a little triumvirate right here, is that first rule of thumb, these are both Nimzovich rules of thumb that I think Kamak talks about a little bit in his book, that, excuse me, first of all, the further a weakened pawn structure advances up the board, the more weak it will become. And that's certainly true with d5. But further, the more, if you have three, like a triumvirate of dudes here, if you're going to push any of them, it should be that guy. Because now after d5, you've weakened so many squares. But now let's get to Gina's point. The computer told Gina, and this is absolutely correct, that no, we're not in any hurry to play e5. Black's position is so good it doesn't matter too much, because Gina's still going to be much better after e5. But a simple move like knight c5, and boy howdy, I don't think you want to let this guy out. Right. Okay, so now a4 is a mistake. Black played very natural moves, and I guess I don't like e4, right? Because that's a nice square for the knight, but we get it. And this is a blitz game, so I'm going to blaze through these things. g5, black should play in all these moments. Should still be playing h6, but nevertheless, won with h6 quite handily here. And the game's over, past a pawn. That was MVL was playing Nepo today, and that was Black's dream, is that A pawn was going to roll in this game. Black actually gets it.